Thank you, Henry, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to say thank you to Calvin Tuttle and Francine Romine. I know that's been a lot of work trying to get this moved to a webinar format. I think you guys have done a great job, and I hope it's a great day. Thank you for the invitation to join you all here and deliver this keynote. I know that Diana Furchcott-Roth from DOT was scheduled to do this. Diana and I know each other well. We work on a lot of these issues together. I've attempted to provide a very, what I hope is a balanced view on what the challenges are in a couple areas that we have here. But honored to have been asked to take your place and look forward to sharing this information with you. Next slide, please, Calvin. The areas that I'm going to cover today are primarily centered around autonomous and connected vehicles. The graphic that you see here is just kind of a insight into how Ford looks at smart mobility writ large. Certainly, we are probably associated most with the vehicle side of these circles. But when we look at smart mobility, it encompasses not only autonomous and connected vehicles, and within connected vehicles are conventional vehicles, of course, but it also encompasses the data that those vehicles generate, as well as what we would call smart mobility. And this is a very large circle that speaks to not only things like micro mobility, which we've invested in, but helping cities, the items that I used to work on in my prior role, in terms of trying to connect vehicles to their larger mobility ecosystem. And how do we help cities, municipalities, states do that better, utilize the data that the vehicles are generating so that we make vehicles safer and that we make transportation more fluid and efficient within an environment. So today I'm just going to talk about the regulatory environment around connected and autonomous vehicles. Those are my two primary responsibilities now for Ford in Washington, D.C. Next slide. So what we're going to talk about in terms of the regulatory outlook for AVs is the work that's been done on getting to a federal legislative framework. In the process of doing that, what else has the Department of Transportation as well as NHTSA doing to help facilitate the introduction of AVs and a little bit on what states are doing. On connectivity, I'm going to dwell a lot on spectrum. And there's probably, most people on this call are aware of this. There's probably not a lot new you're going to learn from this, but what I'm going to offer is kind of an opinion as to how things could play out, depending on how the FCC rules on this. There's a quip in here, you know, what's all the fuss about? Doesn't everyone want safer cars and higher def cat videos? There's this little bit of a battle for the 5.9 spectrum between the unlicensed proponents as well as those that want to retain all of that band for safety use, and we'll talk about that. Next slide. So from an autonomous vehicle standpoint, we'll kick off and just look at the facts. Currently, there is no regulatory framework in place to certify large volumes of AVs. There is an exemption process that NHTSA has that you can apply for that is roughly 2,500 vehicles per year for a 2-year period. A couple of OEMs and AV technology companies have applied for these. Most recently, Neuro was granted one of these exemptions. But it is a process that takes some time. And again, it's only 5,000 units. The last, what I would call serious legislative efforts to establish this regulatory framework for AVs, at least at a federal level, occurred in the last Congress. So you might recall that in the House, there was a bill that went through that had overwhelming bipartisan support. It then languished in the Senate in late 18. And what happened is after the Congress changed and the Democrats assumed the majority in the House, what they did was form a bicameral, bipartisan working group of staff to try and take elements of what there was agreement on in the past efforts and work toward trying to draft an AV bill, and I'll talk about that as well. The concerning thing, I think, for automakers and technology companies is that without this federal framework, every state is also attempting to regulate AV use, and that can create a patchwork of rules and regulations. There are certainly things that are under the purview of the states in terms of vehicle registration, licensing, all those things that states typically do with conventional vehicles. But what we would not want to see is states start to venture into areas that the federal government typically plays a role in. Next slide. So what does industry want from an AV regulatory standpoint? It's kind of captured in the title, and to a large extent, it's to allow the people that are operating in this space, both OEMs and technology companies, to both test and deploy AVs in ever-increasing numbers. To that end, one of the things that we're certainly engaged in is trying to ensure that NHTSA grants exemption requests when they're applied for as expeditiously as possible, because again, that's the only process that exists right now. And then a lot of effort is toward creating this regulatory framework through statute. And what we want to do is expand NHTSA's AV authority. Those of you who are familiar with NHTSA know that all of their vehicle regulations deal with conventional vehicles that require brakes and steering wheels, all the things that with AVs might not be required. So as I mentioned, there's this bipartisan bicameral process underway. Last August and September, there was a lot of outreach to the various stakeholders, OEMs, safety groups, technology companies, to talk about what has worked, what hasn't worked in terms of the language. They've circulated draft language to these stakeholders, which was commented on and sent back. This happened over the course of roughly 5 months. The last batch just got sent back earlier part of this year. I'd have to say that a standalone bill like we had before is probably not likely this year, given the very short legislative calendar that we have, not only because of the election, but obviously the virus is probably going to impact greatly the legislative calendar this year. And then there's obviously a focus on stimulus and trying to get the country back. We also have a variety of trade associations working with us, advocating for a federal bill, the new Automotive Alliance for Automotive Innovation, ITSA, the Self-Driving Coalition. These are the organizations, CTA, that help us try and move this forward. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of what could potentially be in an AV bill, each of these columns represents the 3 rounds of text that were circulated earlier or late last year and then earlier this year. In the first round, we looked at exemptions, how many would be required or how many would be allowed per year while rulemaking was going on. It's expanding testing, the role of advisory committees with Congress and DOT. In the second round, rulemaking, as I mentioned, this notion of what are the federal and state roles in this space. This is very important. And then there was a section, of course, defining all the terms that would be used in the legislation. And in the last round we just completed, there was a section on cybersecurity, one on consumer education, dual use vehicles, how we would collect and use crash data, section on inoperative controls, how to deal with vehicles over 10,000 pounds, and then staffing requirements that would be needed at DOT. There's a lot, obviously, that goes into a piece of legislation like this. The ones that are most important to us, and I believe to most OEMs, are the ones that are highlighted in yellow. As I mentioned, what we're trying to achieve is a greater number of exemptions to deploy these vehicles, to start the rulemaking process at NHTSA that is centered around AVs, and to clarify federal and state rules. Next slide, please, Calvin. So this notion of could we get an AV bill? As I said, I don't think this year, I don't think we'll be able to do it on a standalone basis, but we are looking at opportunities to introduce it potentially, as it rides on a transportation bill of some sort or an infrastructure bill. Some of the encouraging signs we've seen has been House Energy and Commerce Committee held a subcommittee hearing on the 11th of February on AVs. I think overall it was a net positive for people who are advocating for AVs in this space. There were obviously several increases and references to accessibility of the safety aspects. There was a large contingent from the Coalition for the Blind there who were remarking on how enabling these vehicles could be for their constituents. And there was a lot of talk about US competitiveness in this space and the need to maintain that and create the environment that is supportive of development of the technology and deployment of the technology. Again, as I mentioned, I think the things that are playing against legislation this year would be the election calendar as well as coronavirus. This is going to impact how many days Congress gets to meet and talk about things that are unrelated to that was completely unexpected and is going to impact it. And then over the past couple months, you've seen the National Transportation Safety Board comment on some of the accidents that happened with Tesla vehicles. We think this actually may spark an urgency for legislation. We'll have to see. They certainly called for that in some of their remarks. So that could be also an impetus to get something done this year. Next slide, please. So the other things that are going on in this space, DOT did release their AV 4.0 document. This follows the 3 previous versions. They've made refinements and updates to it. Those of you who have looked at it can see where they've essentially tried to mesh this into the president's broader agenda on artificial intelligence. They've tried to group and categorize things and talk about the many initiatives that are underway there to encourage AV development. They did grant NERO's exemption requests, as I mentioned. And then most recently, they've initiated a review of occupant protection regulations. This is the Series 200. So those are underway. The states also continue to legislate in this space, and the areas that they seem to be most focused on are on testing and deployment requirements that occur in each state. We, as an industry, try and make sure that those are linked, because if you're going to test in a state, it's ultimately under the intention that at some point you would deploy. So we always want to see testing and deployment legislation linked together. There's obviously a great deal of concern with liability insurance and what's the appropriate level that a AV provider should be carrying in the state. There is a lot of discussion around data sharing and a notification of accidents or incidents when they occur. What should be their frequency, how much data should be shared, and of course cybersecurity, which is always a concern with both state and federal officials. Next slide, please. So that was pretty much the kind of encapsulated everything that's going on in the AV space. What I want to talk about now is spectrum. Many of you, I know, are aware that it was over 20 years ago when the FCC set aside a portion of the 5.9 gigahertz band to be completely dedicated for automotive safety communications. It took some time to get to a standards level. I think the real work in the band probably began in earnest more along a 10-year ago timeframe. And a lot of the focus has been utilizing a technology known as DSRC, and that has been deployed in the band in limited amounts, both in vehicles as well as in infrastructure around the country in its states. I think if you look at the total number of radios that are in operation today, there's roughly anywhere from 15 to 16,000 that are infrastructure related, and I think there may be as high as 30 to 40,000 in vehicles where the technology has been deployed. Um, the issue has been that over these last 10 years, that because you've got that kind of limited deployment and 75 megahertz of spectrum here in the 5.9 band, the FCC has looked at it and criticized the industry for not having deployed more. And I guess in part of that is maybe criticizing state and local DOTs as well as the federal DOT to not having fully utilized the band. And because of that, it's always been looked at as an opportunity to open it for additional use, primarily in the Wi-Fi space and unlicensed use. So the cable and Wi-Fi industry would like a portion of this. The other thing that's occurred really over the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years has been the emergence of an alternative technology to DSRC, and that's cellular V2X or C-V2X. We've evaluated this at Ford at the Consumer Electronics Show last year in January. We made a declaration that we plan to deploy it in our vehicles starting in 2022 and ultimately have it in all of our vehicles. And then the 5G Automotive Alliance, which we're a part of, as well as a number of other OEMs, chip makers, and technology companies, they filed a waiver in March of last year petitioning the FCC to operate C-V2X in the 5.9 gigahertz band. What we actually asked for was a waiver to utilize the top 2 channels and the top 20 megahertz for C-V2X. Next slide, please, Calvin. So the fuss that's emerging here is that the DOT, as I mentioned, wants to preserve all of the 75 megahertz for automotive safety use. They've made a strong case for the fact that federal and state DOTs have invested for nearly 20 years, both in terms of setting up the standards as well as putting in infrastructure, likely hundreds of millions of dollars, across the country that have been invested. The FCC wants to open that spectrum for shared use, but they also don't want to ignore auto safety. They understand that's important. They see other countries and other regions utilizing the same spectrum for automotive safety, and so there's a benchmark out there to that extent. But the auto industry is kind of split between DSRC and C-V2X proponents. And we too would want to preserve all 75 megahertz for automotive safety, because we feel that one of these technologies will prevail, it will grow, it will need in the future all 75 megahertz because of future use cases, whether those are AVs or broader mobility connection purposes, as well as migration to 5G. And so because of that, neither of us, in terms of proponents of these technologies, want to share it with unlicensed use or Wi-Fi either. Next slide. So where we're at here, and I don't mean to be politically incorrect or politically insensitive, but the term Mexican standoff is one that is a defined term, and the definition is there at the bottom of your screen. It's essentially where we're at with both the FCC, the DOT, and then what I would broadly call users of the spectrum. And in fact, the users there, DSRC, C-V2X, and Wi-Fi, could also assume the positions of each of these gunmen in this picture. Neither wants to give something up because they feel they have a right or a case to it, and others, want to enter this band. So there's no good or bad actors here. In fact, everyone's wearing a black hat, in this picture. But we're at this point where how do we get through this process? So the next slide, please, Calvin. What happened was that the FCC late last year initiated an NPRM where, if you look at today's band allocation for this 75 megahertz, as I said, it's currently all dedicated to ITS from channels 170 through 184. I also show over here, and it's broken because it's actually a much larger band, the 6 gigahertz band, because there is a proceeding that will be discussed at the FCC's monthly meeting later this month, in fact next week, as to whether or not to open 1.2 gigahertz, or roughly 26 times the amount they may be seeking in the 5.9 band, open all of that up to unlicensed use, just to the east of this 5.9 band. What the FCC then proposed in December was what you see on the lower part, was to take that 75 megahertz that's dedicated for ITS and to offer up the bottom 45 to unlicensed or Wi-Fi use, the middle portion, which was basically 10 megahertz for ITS, and they didn't specify whether this was DSRC or C-V2X, but said that they would leave that there, or potentially a guard channel. What they did specify was they would grant the top 20 to C-V2X, which was essentially our waiver request. And then, of course, we still have this proceeding going on in the 6 gigahertz band. So the NPRM basically asked for comments, on the 5.9 band and said, what do people think of this? So if we go to the next slide. Some of the issues that I think those in the transportation space have with what the FCC has proposed is that if you give up the lower 45, one of the issues is there will be no spectrum remaining to transition either DSRC or C-V2X or any other technology to 5G. This is concerning because we know connectivity is growing. We know that there's ways to connect not only vehicles to infrastructure, but pedestrians and bikers and scooters, and a broad array of uses within that mobility ecosystem. And then ultimately there's a use for autonomous vehicles as well, and connectivity becoming what I like to call the fifth sense on an AV. AVs today operate uniquely and independently in their environment, and they use radar, LiDAR, photo, telemetry to guide those vehicles. And once you add connectivity, especially in a 5G perspective, it really becomes a redundant and confirming sense for those previous 4. So we believe it will have an application in AVs. One of the big concerns, and you saw this in a lot of the comments that came in initially on this proceeding, is that there's likely interference with or from unlicensed use in the lower 45 megahertz with any ITS use in the upper 30. And of course, this would be really bad because if you're relying on that upper 30 megahertz for critical safety messages and someone's cat video is interfering with that, it could result in a crash, or it could have helped avoid an accident or a collision. I made the point that the 5.9 band and the portion that we're talking about here is something that's actually internationally harmonized. The US, EU, China, they all use this same section of the 5.9 spectrum. And if we were able to preserve it and use it for ITS, this obviously provides economies of scale for the industry, as well as in terms of deploying it in infrastructure in these markets, and that will help deployment. OEMs are obviously reluctant to deploy new technologies if there aren't assurances of signal clarity, as I just talked about, as well as spectrum availability. So one of the criticisms, this kind of comes full circle, is that you haven't utilized the band over the last 10 or 20 years. And some of the critics will charge, well, you haven't given us clarity or assurances that the band will be available. There seems to be a recurring look at it. One of the reasons that we at Ford declared was to provide some impetus for deployment, to show that there is industry commitment, and that ultimately, assuming that we continue to sell as many vehicles that we do annually into the future, you're looking at over 2 million vehicles a year that could ultimately be equipped with this technology. And in addition to OEMs, both federal and state DOTs are also reluctant to further invest, in ITS without regulatory certainty. Why spend money on something if you don't think there's a future in it? So it's important to get that certainty in place so that we can deploy. Next slide, please. So where are we currently, on the proceeding? There are 2 rounds of comments that were being sought. The first round was due last month in March, and the second round was actually due last week, but was extended due to the virus, and they're due by the end of the month. What we saw in the first round were over 200 institutions, organizations filed comments. And the majority of those actually were very supportive of maintaining all 75 megahertz for ITS. You kind of have the unlicensed proponents, Wi-Fi companies, or people that would utilize that bandwidth against a broader transportation base, from OEMs, highway users, safety groups. There's a whole bunch of people that are advocating for maintaining all 75 megahertz. When you look at the US DOT's filing, as well as the state DOT's, given the investment that they've made in DSRC, there's obviously a bias or a tendency toward favoring that technology. But one of the things that the US DOT did recommend in their filing was that the FCC and DOT kind of settle all of this by entering into a negotiated rulemaking process in order to allocate the spectrum. This is something that they've done in the past. It involves bringing together industry experts. You could see panels being convened with folks from Michigan, University of Michigan, folks from SAE, safety groups. All of the stakeholders who are in this space would get together and over likely some extended period of time decide, what is the best technology, what is the best way to migrate, and what is the best way to allocate in this band. The concern there is that this still doesn't necessarily lead to certainty, certainly not while that is going on, and it could take a very long time, whereas we feel that the industry and drivers and users could actually benefit from having this technology sooner rather than later. Two other developments that I've noted that could impact this proceeding. One was with the virus putting a lot of people at home, working from home. The FCC wanted to ensure that there was enough spectrum available, especially in rural areas. So they temporarily opened the bottom 45 megahertz in various locations around the country to wireless internet service providers. This was just most recently done. We don't really have any reports from the field yet in terms of, has interference occurred? How well is this working? I don't think it's too widely deployed yet at this point, but it does create incumbency in the lower 45 in terms of the way the NPRM was written. And FCC Chairman Pai also indicated that with regards to the 6 gigahertz proceeding and them looking at opening all of that 1200 megahertz for unlicensed use, that he felt that most of the commissioners were supportive of that, and that next week when they vote April 23rd, they could have a large chunk of that. So one might argue, if unlicensed is getting all of that spectrum, do they really still need the lower 45 that they're seeking in this NPRM? So lastly, what are the issues with that NPRM? I'm sorry, I think we went backwards. One more. Okay, so this is my last slide on what could happen. So if the FCC implements the NPRM as written, there's still probably more questions than answers, because we feel there'll be interference. We did some testing actually for DID in Ann Arbor. This was part of our first round comments. We found interference to occur from Wi-Fi devices when you use them in the lower 45 combined with RC-to-X in the upper 20. There still remains a question about how you transition technologies to things like 5G and AV use cases, as well as how do you take incumbents that are in the band and deploy them to other channels? Because right now, DSRC is essentially deployed across all of the channels in that band. And this question of if they implement it as written, will DOTs and OEMs commit to further deployments of ITS? And so it could be the death knell for ITS growing if there isn't enough spectrum to actually deploy it and if there's interference. The second outcome would be that the 5.9 spectrum's retained, all 75 megahertz for ITS, that they allow unlicensed in the 6 gigahertz. And if that happens, how do you then allocate the spectrum between the SRC and C-V2X? You still have this notion of incumbency and how to move existing deployments around. And then you'd have to wonder how long is it going to take for one technology to emerge, as a preferred one. As a colleague of mine and at another OEM said recently, you either drive on the right or the left-hand side of the road, but we don't have both in this country for a very good reason. So it's best to pick one, and move forward. So they'll take some time for that to shake out. And then, of course, we still have this question about spectrum for either technology to transition to 5G and AV use cases. In terms of timing, some commissioners had thought this proceeding could get done by June. I think that was very hopeful. I think it's going to take the better portion of a year, if not longer. One of the things that is likely to move this proceeding along is the chairman's tenure as chairman ends in December. And I think he would like to have this done before he leaves that post. So we'll have to wait and see. So that's really, I think that's the last slide, Calvin. Wanted to thank you for that half hour and giving you an overview of both spaces here. And with that, I'll turn it back over to either Henry or Calvin.